back to this I-24 News Evening Edition. This is a one-on-one. Since 1986, Malcolm Hoenlein has served as Executive Vice Chairman of the Conference of Presidents of Major American Jewish Organizations, coordinating international and national concerns for 52 U.S. Jewish groups. He's become one of the best-known and influential Jewish American figures in the world, maintaining close relationships with Washington and Jerusalem's top offices, an expert on international relations and Israel and Middle East affairs. He serves as an advisor to many public officials alongside keeping regular contact with leaders in the Arab world. Good evening.
Good evening.
Thank you very much for coming to our studio. It's
pleasure.
a great pleasure having you here. And I want to start with you. The last headline that we've been dealing with for the last few weeks is Kerry and top officials, John Kerry, Secretary John Kerry, and top officials in Israel hitting one back and with words. And it seems that the relationship between the United States and Israel, it's not good.
I think the relationship between the United States and Israel is excellent. The day-to-day relationships that don't make headlines, all of the interaction, the joint military exercises, the intelligence cooperation, the joint research and development, all the things that go on a day-to-day basis, that every week virtually there's a delegation from the United States visiting Israel or Israelis visiting the United States. So on the real operational level, there is tremendous cooperation and very positive interaction. The fact is that on this issue, which is very serious. I mean, you're dealing with the future of Israel, the future of the region. The countries in the region all recognize that this is an important issue. It's not the central issue. The Secretary has taken this on as a personal campaign on his part. He's been here a dozen times. He believes very seriously that this is an important activity for the region and for progress and for Israel. And I think he is committed.
Israel says thank you?
Well, look, I think there have been mistakes on both parts. And, you know, we have an old adage that wise people are careful with their words. People have not been careful. Neither the administration, when they talk about warmongering, or when they said that the senators who wanted the sanctions bill want to lead a path to war, or some of the other references. And the Secretary's reference to boycott, not because he supports, he certainly does, and the United States has always opposed the boycott. But the context sometimes determines how people view or perceive, and perception is more important than the reality of the intent. It's how people read it, how do they see it. And the concern here is that when you say, if the talks fail, then boycott somehow will be a reaction, might imply a recognition that that is a legitimate activity when it is not legitimate. And this is not driven because of concern for Palestinians or Israelis. This is an anti-Israel, anti-Jewish effort with the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. And I think, on the other hand, some of the reaction here was not only exaggerated, but inappropriate. And both sides have to tone down the tenor. And it is because it is so serious, and because people don't dismiss what a Secretary of State says on such a sensitive issue. And there are others who exploit it. That has to really be stopped, and I think we have to go back to dealing with things quietly and between the parties.
Do you think that this time is going to be different, the peace process between the Israelis and the Palestinians, because Secretary John Kerry is so firm and so willing to basically live in Israel in order to make this peace process successul?
Look, I think having somebody committed to it does help at times, and the United States plays the role not as a negotiator, because the lesson of history is that the only way you can have a real agreement is if the parties come to it. You can't impose it. There can't be outside parties. They can facilitate, they can help suggest, they can work with the parties, but it has to be direct negotiations, as we've seen this time. And the only way it will succeed is if we find that the Palestinians are really prepared today to put away some of the things that they've said in the last few weeks, which gets very little attention. But when he said he's not going to compromise on the right of return, he will never recognize the Jewish state, he will not do this, he will not do that. Whereas Israel releases prisoners and gets no credit for it in the international community. Nobody says that Netanyahu abided by all agreements, despite the fact that Palestinians continue incitement, continue to violate a lot of the understandings. So it's when both sides are committed and prepared to meet and understand the other's needs, then you could have, and I do believe, honestly, and I worked on this for many years, and I long before many others, I was interested in the Palestinian issue, and I toured refugee camps in Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, because I really believed that to get a solution, you had to solve some of these issues. I really believe that in the end, Palestinians and Israelis can be the closest of allies. They have many things in common, commitment to education, etc. But as long as you have incitement and education to hate, you will never overcome all of the territorial issues and other issues that exist.
But when you hear Abu Mazen saying that he's not going to recognize Israel as the Jewish state, and Benjamin Netanyahu says that this is a main obstacle because the moment that you don't recognize that the state that you're going to do peace with is a Jewish state, I cannot do peace with you. So when this obstacle is on the table, when this issue is on the table, can we say that actually these two have something to talk about?
Well, it's not just on this issue, but the United States' position is that Abbas should recognize Israel as a Jewish state. They use the language. And frankly, I will tell you in the beginning, I personally did not see exactly until I met with Abu Mazen. And when he finished answering me about this, I said, now I really understand what the importance is. And that the reasons that they refuse to recognize it do go to the core of what future coexistence will require. And the failure to recognize, when he demands recognition, they want a Palestinian state. They want to be recognized as that entity, as being the expression of the Palestinian national aspirations. Well, then he has to recognize that Israel is the expression of the Jewish national aspiration.
So we know what Abu Mazen, of course, is thinking, but you know also what the Arab world is thinking about Israel. Although the Arab world around Israel is in a big, let's say, mess. Volcano. Do they think that, or do they support a peace agreement with Israel?
I think that today the eruptions in the Middle East have highlighted a number of things. One is that the source of stability in the region is Israel, not of instability. And that many of them, in our conversations with us, they see the Palestinian issue today as an annoyance, as an obstacle. It's not because they sit down and the first thing they say is, oh, we've got to solve this issue. They have bigger issues. Iran is a bigger issue. And they say to us that Israel is our only hope because they don't believe that the West is really going to take the actions necessary. And for them, Iran is an existential threat. They say Israel can defend itself. We can't.
So if I'm understanding correctly, can Israel and the Arab world actually cooperate in the Iranian issue?
They can be. As I said, but the changes have
taken place. Or they're already cooperating.
Well, look at Egypt and Israel, what they're doing together in the Sinai and what they've done. Israel and Jordan, the relationship. We had it at times with Lebanon, certainly. And the truth is that if you remove one element from this equation, and that's Iran, as instigating, undermining all of these regimes, fomenting terror, supporting all violations of human rights, but any kinds of groups that, like Hezbollah, like Hamas, you change the Middle East. You know, we've inverted the formula by saying we've solved Palestinian issue, then we can deal with Iran. No, you solve Iran, believe me, you can make a deal with the Palestinians right away. You can solve many of the issues in the region.
Although
doesn't mean instantly we're going to have love affairs. But
although sometimes, you know, you hear the Arab countries using the Palestinian cards all the time, because if you will reach peace with the Palestinians, we're not your problem. But right now you're saying that actually it's the other way around.
Well, they do, but I think you're right. Look, I'm not fooled by the fact that this serves their temporary purposes. Whether this is a long-term commitment where they're really ready to accept Israel in the region and they have offered the 22 states to have a peace agreement as part of this equation. But I think the developments have underscored the importance of Israel to them. And Israel has a lot to offer these countries. They have a lot to offer Israel. It's not going to be a transition, and the governments are going to have to do a job, like in Jordan, to make it a peace not of the king and not of the government, but a peace of the people. We see the polls show that's not true. It's not true in other countries because they've been educated to hate for so long that it'll take a long time to root that out. But that's a responsibility of governments. What they say to me sometimes is, we pray that Israel will do it. We'll condemn them, but we pray for them. And there is a dichotomy in terms of the relationship and the way they approach Israel. But a recognition today that Israel isn't what it's been portrayed all the years to be.
I wonder what Israel will be blamed for if it will reach the Palestinian, reach an agreement with the Palestinian. What would our world blame Israel for afterwards?
Because it's Israel's existence, the problem. Like the BDS movement and the delegitimization, it's not about 67, it's not about a policy, and it's not about, settlements. It's about 47. It's about Israel's right to exist. It's about the right of the Jewish people to have a national expression. And whereas in the past they would attack the individual Jew and condemn, so today they attack the collective Jew, the state of Israel. But they mean the Jewish people. This is the same, rooted in the same kind of anti-Semitism that we saw 70 years ago and that unfortunately we have seen throughout our history. And we have to recognize it for what it is, and governments and all of us have to take an absolute stand and say we're not going to tolerate it anymore. We're not going to excuse it. And whether it's in the cultural realm or entertainment figures or whether it's in business, whatever sector, when they engage in these policies, not criticism of Israel, but policies to isolate, denigrate, and diminish and demonize the Jewish state and through that the Jewish people, we will not tolerate it. And we're going to hold people to account for their behavior in this regard. This is, together with Iran, the cutting-edge issue of our time, for which future generations will hold us to account. And we've seen that where you stand up to it, these guys back off. It's the same as you deal with terrorists. If they find weakness, they exploit it. And when they find strength, they back off from it. Syria responded when American ships were around it. Gaddafi responded when they thought that they were going to be next on the hit list. That's the message to tyrants and to anti-Semites.
How can you explain that in 2014, for example, it's not that Israel and Jewish people are dealing only with our world with anti-Semitism, but they're also dealing with it in the West. We just saw what happened in France a week ago, right. 2 weeks ago, what happening with Dieudonné. This is something that is not, in 2014, you cannot understand how it continues to happen.
We see many isms that are coming back. In part, we see Europe moving in two directions, towards unity, towards disunity. We see recidivist movements. We see the rise of extremist parties in Jobbik in Hungary, the Golden Dawn in Greece. But the Greek government acted. They outlawed them. They didn't say that we just condemn them or something. They acted against them, which is a model of how you have to deal with it. Society is not governed, not judged whether they have haters. Every society has haters. The question is, how do the authorities figures deal with them? How do you isolate them? How do you confront them? How do you educate the young not to fall into the trap? And we are seeing, and it comes out of the Palestinian Authority, a lot of the instigation on this BDS movement. Extremist parties, people who are anti-Semites, all of a sudden found a legitimate cover to do it. And as we get distant from the Holocaust, Europeans feel less guilt and less restraint from openly expressing the same kind of things when they attack Brit Milah and Shechita, Jewish ritual slaughter. These are traditional ways, age-old ways, of striking at the Jewish people.
Do you see it happening also in the United States?
Absolutely. The BDS movement, boycott, divestment, sanctions, other things, it's not to the same degrees in Europe, but we see it. We recently had the American Studies Association call for a boycott. 220 university presidents have already come out and said we will not be part of it, we'll be not part of the association's activities. It's a tremendous repudiation. But we see it. We see the same kind of, because of the internet, you can spread messages worldwide instantly through cable, through all of the other means. It took Hitler months to spread a big lie. Today you do it in seconds. And if you don't respond immediately, as you know, on the internet, the story is out.
So sometimes I see that Israel don't respond immediately. Sometimes it seems that Israel have a lack of foreign policy, of foreign, let's say, advocacy that actually is working outside. And it seems that Israel is not playing the game right.
I think Israel is doing a much better job at it. But the deck is really stacked against us when the majority of the world's media, even though the anti-Semites accuse us of controlling the media, I wish it were true and we would have much better coverage of Israel and of the Jewish people. The fact is that they fall victim to the lies, to the distortions, misrepresentations, some of them so ludicrous. But it is a reality that Israel has to fight an uphill battle against a world media that is ready to jump on it for any perceived right or wrong. And often, when there's no factual basis, it doesn't matter about the nature of the coverage that emerges and how distorted the images of what Israel does. Israel's good in flying aid, what they're doing for Syrian refugees, or what they did in the Philippines, what they did in Haiti, that doesn't make big stories. What makes stories is when you have a picture of a child being carried in Gaza and it turns out that it was killed in a car accident 7 years earlier. You don't see the apology for it. So Israel has to do more. We have to learn to use the new media, the social media, and turn to 19-year-olds to help direct policy and to help get it out.
Malcolm Hoenlein, thank you very, very much for this interview. I can stay here and speak with you more than 16 minutes. Thank you very much for this. And thank you, our viewers, for being with us tonight. Tomorrow we will be here at the same time, same place from the Jaffa Port, Israel. Have a great night.